Today, our goal is to get as far as the Japan discussion. But before we dive into last time might have been a bit tough, but it's actually really important. For example, let's say US Treasury bonds offer a 5% annual yield. If American citizens engage in productive economic activities and generate higher returns than the interest paid on government bonds, then although some businesses earn more than others, it still makes more sense for the government to spend through bond issuance rather than raising taxes. Because if you raise taxes, you're essentially taking money that could earn 6% and redirecting it to finance bonds yielding only 5%. But this virtuous cycle can easily turn into a vicious one. If government debt becomes excessive and trust in it declines, interest rates rise. Then the government struggles just to service its debt, and if it tries to raise taxes to pay off that debt, the economy starts to stagnate and society loses its vitality. So the key is keeping interest rates low while sustaining government spending. Because if spending collapses, the country could end up like Greece. Society descends into chaos. There are people who rely on pensions and other forms of government support, and they're not the ones actively producing value. They either contributed in the past or will contribute in the future. So the government needs to transfer wealth to those not currently producing. But if it can't issue bonds, it can't spend, so their income dries up. That leads to social fragmentation. Younger generations who are economically active may resent the tax burden used to support older generations, deepening social divisions. In geopolitics, we often treat nations like the US, Japan, or China as unified organisms. But if you look at protests in China, you realize the government's interests don't always align with those of the people. So when we look at a country as a whole, we need to remember that there's both cohesion and centrifugal force at play. In Korea, during events like the World Cup, we act like meerkats completely in sync, right? We all watch the same thing and react the same way. But when it comes to politics, we split right down the middle, centrifugal force takes over. That's the lens through which we should analyze any nation. So when a government faces economic challenges and can't issue bonds, when its ability to issue debt declines, the forces pulling society apart grow stronger than those holding it together. Society begins to fracture. To hold it together, a charismatic leader often steps in to restore order. But if that leader relies solely on charisma rather than economic strength, you usually don't end up with the kind of healthy democracy we'd hope for. Russia under Putin is a good example of that. It's true for individual nations, but globally, the US is no longer just a single country either. I probably don't need to explain that further to you. You've already sat through 14 lectures so far, so you know America isn't just one country. The way the US manages to keep treasury yields low, it's not just America's problem, it's everyone's problem. Whether we realize it or not, we're all affected by this. Whenever the Fed or its chair raises interest rates to defend the dollar, we feel the impact immediately and directly. The question is, can the US maintain this system, call it an empire, hegemony, or dominance, whatever you prefer, and still remain the anchor of global order? That's the biggest geopolitical question right now. Let me show you just how important bonds are. One of President Clinton's advisors once said, if I could be reborn, I'd want to come back as a bond. It sounds ridiculous. How could you be reborn as a bond? But that's how much influence bonds carry. More precisely, it's not the bonds themselves, but their yields that shape everything. Remember when Britain and France took unilateral military action in Suez? They went ahead without even consulting the US. President Eisenhower was something of an idealist, and he condemned such behavior by allies as imperialist. So he played a strong card, hinting that the US might dump British bonds. He didn't actually do it, but the mere suggestion made Britain back down, because dumping British bonds would crash their price. And when bond prices fall, interest rates rise. Bonds and interest rates move in opposite directions. If UK bonds tank in value, their yields would spike instantly. Nobody would invest in the UK, business would grind to a halt. That's why bonds are so powerful and so dangerous. To make that kind of threat even toward an ally is no small matter. Historians still debate whether the US actually had the power to do that at the time. But honestly, that's not what really matters. What matters is that Eisenhower merely implying it forced Britain to back off from what they saw as a matter of life and death, the Suez Canal. And they gave it up. Britain must have thought, fine, you arrogant Americans, go run the world yourselves. Let's see how well you handle it. And sure enough, with idealists like Eisenhower holding power repeatedly, the US found itself sinking deeper into quagmires in the Middle East and elsewhere. It was chaos, pure chaos, until Nixon came along. Today, the interest the US pays annually on its debt relative to GDP. The principal doesn't matter much since they just issue new bonds to pay off old ones. Only a government can do that, roll over debt at will. But the interest must be paid every single year. That's the cost of maintaining the debt. You can pay it through taxes or issue new bonds to pay that too. But then you're just piling on more interest payments. Keep that in mind when looking at the debt situation. This is the current US public debt as a percentage of GDP. It's at 125% right now, 125%. That ratio is the same as it was during World War II. The pandemic was effectively a war, financially speaking. When Britain gave up its empire, its debt stood at 250% of GDP. Britain was a powerhouse in the 19th century. It ruled over a quarter of the Earth's surface, the empire on which the sun never set. And it didn't suffer from the kind of schizophrenic tendencies we see in the US today. For the most part, the British knew exactly what they were doing. Of course, not every single time. They knew exactly what it meant to run an empire, but the US is an empire that hates the idea of empire. It wants to lead the world through a noble dream of nation states negotiating around a table rather than through imperial dominance. Despite its power, Britain lost its empire by getting involved in World War I and II. Those were unique and extraordinary wars, but still, scholars note that at the time, Britain's public debt reached 250% of GDP, 2.5 times. Today, Japan's debt is even higher, though it's not an empire anymore. But the US, as the core of the global order, now sits at 120%. That's a red flag. US defense spending is under 4% of GDP. That's money spent gone for things like salaries each year. It goes to military wages, personnel, and expendables. Plus, there's the cost of overseas bases and operations. Altogether, it remains under 4% of GDP. So the green line here shows total amount and the blue line shows it declining relative to GDP. During the Korean War, defense spending peaked at 17% of GDP, huge. It dropped afterward. Even during the Vietnam War, it didn't rise that high again. There was a slight bump during the Iraq War, but generally it stayed below 5%. Historian Niall Ferguson, in his study of empires, noted that when the cost of debt, usually interest, surpasses the cost of defense, that's when empires collapse. So let's now look at how much the US is paying in bond interest. Currently, about 10% of federal spending goes to bond interest. That's $400 billion, almost neck and neck with the defense budget. What this means is whether the US is defending the world order or its own land. As the center of global enforcement, the money spent on that role is nearly equal to the interest it pays on its debt. In 2022, it went even higher. No surprise given the wave of stimulus packages, especially the massive ones from the Biden administration. By 2021, it was close, and it's projected to surpass defense spending by 2024. Before World War II, Britain's debt interest reached about 10% of GDP. The US isn't there yet currently at 4% to 5%, but pessimistic forecasts say it might reach that level by 2030. In short, the US may no longer be able to shoulder the economic burden of empire. Keynes referred to this system we live under as post-1945. The gold window closed. Nixon shut it in 1971, but still, if we still call it the Bretton Woods system, economists say it ended long ago, but geopolitical thinkers like Peter Zeihan still call it Bretton Woods. Because the essence hasn't changed. The Bretton Woods system was designed by Dexter White and Keynes together. At the time, they never imagined the US would become a current account deficit country. And for a long time after the war, the belief was firm that balance of payments issues simply didn't apply to the US. Even scholars only wrote papers under that assumption. Back then, the global problem was a shortage of dollars. One thing I've realized talking to people who study economics through Bitcoin is this. They simply can't imagine a world where dollars are in short supply. But when the Bretton Woods system was created, US academics were actually talking about a dollar shortage. Because America was the only competitive economy left, foreign countries simply couldn't earn dollars. To get dollars, the US would need to import goods. But made in USA was already the best, so there was nothing worth importing. So here's the logic they followed. America had preserved both its resources and industry. While countries like Britain, Germany, and Japan, close competitors, had been devastated, China and Korea were still agrarian at the time. So the US was destined to run trade surpluses. The answer? Public foreign aid and investment. Just give aid. Or do what the British Empire did, invest in core industries using bonds. Then foreign nations would use that investment to buy American goods, creating jobs at home thanks to booming exports. So the cycle worked, but global liquidity was still short. Dollars were scarce. Now, looking back, it sounds naive, but America believed it could sustain this cycle forever because it had an overwhelming trade advantage. Foreigners will always want made in USA products. So we give them aid or invest in them, send out dollars, and they come back to buy American goods. That creates more jobs for Americans. In short, you give money to foreigners and it boomerangs back into US jobs. If empire works like that, sure, why not? It's like a perpetual motion machine. You act generous and the money circles back to fuel your own economy. Why wouldn't you do it? It sounds perfect. But of course, it was too good to be true. Within 15 to 20 years, the US began running trade deficits and the dollar shortage theory disappeared. During COVID, when the dollar surged, people started worrying about dollar shortages again. But what did the US do? It printed money like crazy. There was so much global dollar liquidity, it triggered inflation everywhere. But we shouldn't take these short-term swings as proof of long-term truths. Still, people get swept up in short-term phenomena. Bitcoin wasn't designed for these momentary fluctuations. When money flooded the system during COVID, people thought inflation is coming fast, buy crypto or real estate or you'll be left behind. But then the US raised interest rates and everything flipped instantly, didn't it? These are surface level shifts. The deeper issue is not a true dollar shortage. A real dollar shortage would come if the US said, we can't be an empire anymore. We won't import. We'll make everything ourselves and protect our jobs. Then the world would really run short of dollars. Because dollars only flow out when the US runs a current account deficit. If the US returns to surplus, it starts pulling dollars back in. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, no one thought America would ever lose its competitive edge. It makes sense, right? Even the brilliant Keynes didn't foresee it. In geopolitical terms, 70 years is just one chapter. But for us as individuals, if something lasts even 10 years, we tend to assume that's just how the world works. It becomes the new normal. That's understandable, but it's wild that we can't even imagine issues that were front and center just 70 years ago. It shows just how limited our imagination has become. This problem is especially serious in Korea's intellectual circles. Remember, Plato taught history, philosophy, music, physical education, even math. Even if you're in the sciences, I think you still need to study history and philosophy. Because philosophy isn't organically part of our culture, we have to study it deliberately. In Western societies, it's somewhat embedded, but for us, we really lack that foundation. Now, the US starts begging, begging in 1960. Remember, World War II ended in 1945. Back then, America was basically the only intact industrial power. Everyone else had been bombed to ruins. So when I say begging, I'm exaggerating for effect, but still, it took only 15 years for the US to go from dominance to asking others for help. By the 1960s, the US was in Germany, stationed in a country it had bombed to rubble. And they said, hey, help pay for our troops. Like, from Germany's perspective, they could have said, we didn't ask for your army, take them back. But they couldn't, because the Soviets were looming nearby. So Treasury officials Dillon and Anderson went to Bonn in 1960 to ask for troop support, basically to beg. As Europe recovered, the US wanted to stop the outflow of dollars, so they asked Germany to share costs for US forces. Anyone who knows the military knows it's not just soldiers, it's full of civilian staff who need salaries. I believe that's also how it works in Korea. Korea pays the salaries of its local civilian employees. So the US said you should cover those costs, and they were flat out rejected. That was the first real pushback. And we still see this issue today. It just keeps coming back, even bigger. Diplomatically, it failed, but this marked the first time the US had to ask other countries for financial help. It signaled the end of unilateral American contributions. And this was the 1960s, much earlier than most people realize. By 1971, at the International Monetary Fund annual meeting, the United States openly called for burden sharing. Funny thing is, rumors were flying that the US didn't have enough gold reserves. Officially, gold convertibility was still allowed. Treasury Secretary John Connolly made a now famous remark at that time. He was trying to persuade allies, but they weren't listening. He couldn't just say, "We're going bankrupt." That would trigger a self-fulfilling collapse. Say that, and it becomes true. So instead, it's more like, hey, read the room. But France read the room in the opposite way, anti-American as usual. They knew exactly what was going on. The US urged Germany and Japan to be discreet, but they didn't get the hint. So Connolly said his famous line, "The dollar is our currency, but your problem." That was his indirect way of saying, we're on the brink. By collapse, we mean default, a moratorium. Bring your gold, we can't return it. We still want an open global system, but the US can no longer back it alone. Other countries must share the load. That was their message. Then on August 15th, Nixon shut the gold window. It's called the Nixon shock. Just 6 months before that, the Treasury Secretary had stood at the IMF meeting and said, "We will not change the price of gold. We will control inflation." In Paul Volcker's memoir, he asked the Secretary, "Is that really true?" And the response was, "Who knows about summer, but for now it's the truth." So the Treasury Secretary of the world's anchor economy completely reversed his stance in just 6 months. Governments have no choice but to lie. It's a sad but inevitable truth. In my book, I described it as being like the owner of a theater that's caught fire. Imagine you're the owner and you see smoke in the back during a movie. You smell something burning. People start murmuring, sensing something's wrong. If you're the theater owner, do you shout, "Fire"? Should you tell the truth? There's a fire. Everyone panic. What do you think would happen? In fire incidents, few people die from flames. Most die from smoke inhalation or getting trampled. A wise theater owner would say something like this: "Oh, it's nothing. Just a bit of smoke," and then quietly secure exits and let people out in an orderly fashion. To be truly wise, two things are required: wisdom and moral integrity. Finding a leader who has both is incredibly rare. A wise but immoral leader, he'll just save himself and leave you behind. Right now, the crypto industry is filled with leaders who are neither wise nor moral. People aren't always worth trusting. Don't assume the US Treasury Secretary lied when he said something that got reversed 6 months later. This is just the nature of government. Governments can't afford to create panic. Even if collapse is imminent, they can't say it. They'll say things like, "The fundamentals are strong," indirectly, of course. That phrase usually means the exact opposite. We're about to crash. It's the final cry of desperation. It's basically saying, "Good luck, save yourselves." The US never said it outright, but that's how governments work. It's sad. Being in that position at that moment is a painful place to be. Why? If you said, "We're closing the gold window in 6 months," what do you think would happen? It would happen immediately. You'd get a bank run the next day. At the time, Paul Volcker wasn't Fed chair, he was a senior Treasury official. He asked the secretary, "Are we okay?" And the response was, "Today that's the position we must maintain. As for the summer, I have no idea." Of course he didn't, only the president could decide that. Whether we call the US an empire or a hegemon post 1945. Let's leave that debate to the scholars. What matters is the wisdom you need to live through this era. You were born into the American era. You're living through it. I don't know if it'll still be the American era when you die, but you need discernment. Avoid conspiracy theories. Also avoid blind optimism. Wake up from fairy tales too. Escape from the myths of paranoia and conspiracy. That's why we need to study geopolitics with this kind of lens. Remember how I talked about bonds? There's the economic benefit the US gains by running the global order and the geopolitical benefits. And sometimes those two collide. If both moved in sync, it would be great. It would be like that perpetual motion machine we mentioned earlier. Post-World War II, America stood alone giving aid, loved and respected by the world. And the aid money came back as purchases of US goods, creating jobs, which enabled more aid, more respect, more jobs, more aid, more jobs. But that fantastic honeymoon didn't last long. The ones America helped up started climbing over it, running surpluses and defying orders. So America's military geopolitical elites ended up overpowering the economic geopolitical elites. The era when military geopolitical elites said we must prioritize security is called benevolent hegemony. But when economic elites overpowered military elites in the US and insisted economics must come first, and we call that predatory hegemony. After World War II, things ran smoothly like a perpetual engine until the honeymoon ended abruptly. The Korean War was a major turning point. Right after the honeymoon phase, America entered its phase of benevolent imperialism. But that didn't last long. It quickly shifted to a more extractive form of hegemony. In other words, economic elites began to dominate military strategists, and the US adopted a more economy-first strategy. But the two forces clashed then and now, and even the US finds this tension difficult to manage. A prime example of this is the reconstruction of Europe. Some mistakenly believed that the EU was built to oppose the US, but the EU itself was originally America's idea. The US said, you guys get along, form a team, and stop causing trouble. You don't have to be pro-America, just don't go pro-Soviet. This vision of a unified, independent Europe came from America's geopolitical elite. The Korean War played a major role. America realized it couldn't contain the Soviets alone, especially without a strong ground army. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome created the European Economic Community, the predecessor to today's EU. It began as a coal and steel union, but they couldn't have built it without US backing. These were all US allies. Had America objected, it would have never happened. So it's easy to infer America was behind it all. They even created a payment alliance. Let's stop using the dollar. Hard to imagine now, don't use the dollar, because dollar-based settlements are causing a dollar shortage. So let's exchange IOUs among ourselves and settle in dollars just once at the end. That's what we call a clearing union or payments alliance. Technically, pounds and francs were supposed to be convertible into dollars, but in practice they weren't. It was mostly symbolic. They just circulated promissory notes within the bloc. By 1958, under US approval, they ran surpluses and resumed convertibility into dollars. The US allowed all of this to happen. It didn't benefit America economically, but geopolitically, the US wanted Europe to become strong enough to counter the Soviet Union. At the time, the USSR had a fervent communist ideology, and it was the symbolic homeland for communists worldwide. Plus, countries like Ukraine, Poland, and Hungary were under Soviet influence. The US was nervous, so were Britain and France. In that moment, geopolitical priorities overruled economic concerns. But from America's standpoint, fulfilling geopolitical goals meant bearing a heavy economic burden. So they told their allies, we can't do this alone. Let's create a table and share the cost. The US paid $2 billion, Germany $1 billion, the UK $1 billion, France $550 million, Italy $550 million, Japan $250 million, Canada $200 million, and so on. That's how the foundation for the Group of 10 and later the Group of 20 was born in 1962. These platforms were built because the US could no longer shoulder the cost of managing the world alone. As American capital kept flowing to Europe, the US imposed the interest equalization tax. This is relevant to those who claim the US will ban Bitcoin. It shows how America reacts to capital outflows. Historically, the US avoids capital controls. It's in their DNA. But this tax was precisely a form of capital control. It taxed Americans for investing abroad. People invested abroad simply because foreign interest rates were higher. So the US taxed foreign investments to discourage that behavior, making higher yields overseas effectively meaningless. Capital was flowing out of the US, while Europe still had strict capital controls. So once money went to Europe, it didn't come back. China's similar today. It's a capital control country. This kind of tax on capital outflows is similar to what's known as the Tobin tax. Nowadays, raising interest rates brings capital flooding back into the US. But raising rates risk recession, so it wasn't a viable option back then. If someone says the US will ban Bitcoin, tell them this story. Volcker describes it in his book. They hastily passed the bill with little nuance. US officials learned a big lesson from that. Once it passed, the phone lines lit up, chaos everywhere. Please exempt Canada. Please exempt Japan, boy. Please exempt Germany. It was a simple law. Tax capital outflows. But they had to include a flood of exemptions because the US is not a monolith. Congress has pro-Canada, pro-Japan, pro-China, pro-Korea, pro-Germany, pro-UK factions. Lobbyists were relentless. Volcker put it this way. A simple bill turned into a spaghetti mess of exceptions due to foreign protests and congressional lobbying. How arbitrary and complicated control really is. Control is never easy. Ironically, the US's attempt at capital control only accelerated the rise of the euro-dollar market. Kyoden Toyu, a Japanese Ministry of Finance official, said, "We remembered the lesson of the interest equalization tax for a long time." He meant, the US talks about freedom all the time, but when it really matters, they change the rules without warning. That's the takeaway. US attempts at capital control have repeatedly failed because America doesn't operate with a unified national interest. That's the nature of empire. We talked about this before. To maintain empire, America may one day have to abandon republicanism just like Rome did. Why? As Trump's election revealed, global leaders and media found America's political volatility deeply unsettling. In Korea, it swings from right to left, no big deal. Because we're not a reference point for the world. But when the US swings from Trump to Biden and back again, builds a wall, then tears it down, then builds it again, the world gets whiplash. Because America isn't simple, it may have to give up political dynamism. In other words, it might need to embrace aristocracy. You can't keep handing power to the people if it makes the system unstable. You end up ruling strictly by rulebook. That's not democracy anymore. Every decision is scripted. What you get is pure bureaucracy. AI ends up running the system, removing even human bureaucrats. You don't want FIFA to be democratic, right? It had just become a swamp of corruption. Even soccer games now use AI and sensors to make decisions, right? Back in the day, it was all run by committees so naturally, it was full of corruption. We don't want the global standard to be unstable or too dynamic. That's just the nature of it. When the US does something drastic, like announcing capital controls, it triggers massive lobbying. Why? Because America is also a country run by bankers who hate capital controls. So in many ways, it's a country that can't act decisively. As I said before, there's a tension between geopolitical interests and economic interests. That's not a perfect classification, but still, Nixon and Kissinger found a kind of artistic solution. After the dollar was unlinked from gold, the world began questioning its value. But when the dollar serves as the global reserve currency, America gets two key benefits. First, dollars circulating abroad are technically US debt, but never get redeemed. Second, holding dollars usually means buying US Treasury bonds, which helps the US keep interest rates low. But I personally question whether this benefit comes solely from dollar usage. Most scholars accept those 2 points, but I find them a bit suspicious. Anyway, this is what we call the petrodollar system. Kissinger made a deal with the Saudi royal family. Saudi Arabia is a total exception in many ways. They've never been seriously sanctioned by the US over human rights. America doesn't protect Saudi Arabia, it protects the royal family. Saudi Arabia in itself has very little institutional capability. They don't want their citizens to become too educated, just religious education from the Quran. That's why extremists emerged from there and later attacked the US on September 11th. In a sense, the US reaped what it sowed. Saudi Arabia even imports its fighter pilots from Pakistan. The royal family cares about one thing only. They don't want an educated or empowered population. Their income comes from oil, not taxation, so they don't need an engaged citizenry. And that aligns perfectly with US interests. When Saudi Arabia asked the US, "What do you want from us?" they probably expected a demand for oil or oil taxes, but that wasn't it. Just settle your oil transactions in dollars. That was the simple request. Saudi said, sure, we have to sell oil anyway. Might as well use dollars. Once Saudi priced oil in dollars, everyone else followed. So whether you're Japan or Germany, you need dollars to buy oil. Geopolitically, this move pulled Saudi Arabia firmly into the American camp. The Middle East was a Cold War battleground between the US and USSR. It's a complex region, but Saudi was the largest oil producer. So bringing Saudi fully under the US umbrella created limits on how much Saudi could align with anti-US or anti-Israel states like Egypt. Sometimes geopolitics and economics actually align. Rare, but it happens. But for American idealists, this was a nightmare. During Trump's presidency, a Saudi journalist entered the Saudi consulate in Turkey and never came out because he was likely tortured and killed. Turkey leaked the evidence to the global media. There was global outrage, but Trump imposed no sanction because of the immense power of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He bought massive quantities of American fighter jets. It gave Trump's opponents a chance to criticize, but really it's America's perpetual dilemma. They tried to trap Trump in that contradiction, but he gave a rather absurd answer. He didn't mention human rights at all. He just said, they bought lots of our F-16s and F-18s. Even if Trump becomes president, he can't change much in the US. Likewise, even if Biden becomes president, he can't undo much of what Trump did either. Because there's a deep underlying manual that governs the empire. It's not a conspiracy, it's just the nature of an empire. But with issues like gay marriage or social topics, they're not related to how the empire is managed. So administrations focus on those for differentiation. So when Biden came in and tried to reverse everything Trump did, He made gestures about human rights and criticized the journalist killing, and that really pissed off MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. So when Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices soared, Biden asked MBS for help and got completely rejected, even humiliated. That's the kind of mechanism in play. All of this is a nightmare for American idealists. The fact that the US has to protect a country like Saudi Arabia to maintain the petrodollar system, but geopolitically it makes sense. Kissinger was a realist, and from that standpoint it was a brilliant idea. It's lasted this long precisely because it was so effective. The deal: America protects the Saudi royal family and stays quiet on human rights. Things are changing now. We don't know what's next for Saudi Arabia. In Peter Zeihan's book, he writes that if the US ever lets go of Saudi, and now it might because the US no longer needs their oil, Zeihan predicts Saudi Arabia might be forced to seek a security alliance with Israel. This shift gives us a glimpse of how future alliances may form. Whether America remains a benevolent hegemon or not, if it decides we don't want to be the world police anymore, then countries like Korea or Japan might respond like this. Station troops here like you did in Saudi Arabia, and we'll pay for it and buy some of your weapons each year. We don't have oil, but we can contribute in other ways. This was the Kimerica era. By 2014, China's foreign reserves approached $4 trillion. The US borrowed, and China held its debt, lots of US treasuries. In that era, China helped sustain the dollar's status. How? By buying US Treasury bonds. Bonds are key. That helped keep US interest rates low, which let Americans borrow, invest, and consume more easily. Then came the 2008 financial crisis. America's financiers blew it up. Governments worldwide announced stimulus, and China's was worth 20% of its GDP. One reason Korea recovered quickly from the 2008 crisis is that our economy barely got hit was because we had China right next to us. China experienced a sharp but short downturn and rebounded quickly. So in Chinese minds, we're the ones holding up the world now. That should have led to pride, but instead it turned into the US, they're nothing special. The top chart shows the US consumes through government debt. The bottom chart shows China saves what it produces. The scales aren't identical, but the trends are clear. So America stimulates its economy through government debt, whereas China is a nation that saves what it produces. By that logic, China looks like the rising power, while America appears to be in decline. So after the 2008 crisis, many Korean intellectuals, everyone around me was confidently saying the same thing far too easily. The American era is over, the Chinese era has begun. Let's talk a bit about Japan. To America, there's a country they find easy to push around: Japan. Japan isn't like Korea or China. It actually challenged the US. They went head-to-head with the US, not in guerrilla warfare, but in full-scale war. Think Midway. Japan was the enemy of America. If America is an empire, then Japan is a conquered territory. Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility on August 15th. There were two reasons. First, August 15th was a Sunday. Markets opened Monday. He wanted to shock the markets beforehand. He went to Camp David Friday, then made the announcement on live TV Sunday. But what is August 15th? Korea's Liberation Day? You think Nixon cared about that? Our Liberation Day is the day Japan surrendered. So is it a coincidence Nixon announced the gold shock on Japan's surrender day? Nixon was furious with Japan. Why? It reflects what many in Washington felt but wouldn't say aloud. These guys lost to us and now they're crawling back up. Why is their economy doing so well? And it's all thanks to us anyway. At the time, Japan was exporting massive amounts of textiles to the US. American textile jobs were at risk, factories were collapsing. Nixon made a campaign promise to protect American textile jobs by setting quotas on Japan. Japan's prime minister made a secret deal with Nixon once he was elected, but Japan broke the deal, pretended it never happened. Then they made a separate deal with Nixon's Democratic rival in that region. Japan lacked political sensitivity. They didn't understand American politics. Nixon was furious. This became known as the Textile Secret Pact Incident. Ironically, ending gold convertibility hurt the most obedient US allies. France, who ignored the US, yet said, "Ha, told you so, we already converted to gold." Countries like the UK and Germany, loyal allies, trusted the dollar. They held dollars, not gold, and took the hit. Japan got hit the worst. They avoided converting to gold, afraid of upsetting the US. America should have felt guilty, but instead they just resented Japan. So they dropped the bomb on August 15th without any prior notice. This shows when it comes to Japan, the US you think you know doesn't really apply. They act like a true empire, with Japan in particular, not even with Germany. They simply lack respect for Japan. And if America gets more desperate, they might treat us the same way. There's another reason Japan got under America's skin. We only lost to the US in war, otherwise we're an independent power. We've got our own deals with China and the Soviets. So we need to work something out with China, thus warming up to Beijing. But for America, détente with China was a major historical strategy. Japan almost ruined it. They tried to make the first move with China. From America's view, Japan was the child that kept trying to rise above its station. Kissinger reportedly said this: "Of all the damn traitors, the Japanese are the ones who stole the cake." Henry Kissinger met with Prime Minister Tanaka and pleaded with him. They asked Japan to delay establishing diplomatic ties with China because the US couldn't do it immediately. Kissinger did all this by secretly flying to China, remember? Then Japan picked up on the signal, "Oh, establishing relations with China? Then we'll do it." And they went and met them. Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong welcomed them warmly. The US, on the other hand, had to wait through 2 administrations before formalizing ties. But Japan did it right then, because Japan isn't a country that's swayed by ideology. From the US perspective, it's infuriating. Like I said before, in a company, I might cut the other side some slack. But that leniency has to come from me, not some junior under me. That's unforgivable, and Japan acted exactly like that. So what happened to Prime Minister Tanaka? He got caught up in a scandal led by the US, stepped down, and I think he was even prosecuted and jailed. That completely ended his political career. Years later, Kissinger subtly hinted that he was behind it. He just said, the Tanaka affair didn't go well. Kissinger was a national security advisor and Tanaka was a prime minister. Kissinger tried to arrange a meeting with him, but Tanaka refused twice, saying their ranks didn't match. Kissinger was furious, obviously. "I report directly to President Nixon, and you, the little prime minister of a defeated nation, who might not even last 6 months, you refuse to meet me." So even after finally meeting and pleading, Tanaka flatly refused to delay normalization with China, because Nixon would lose face if Japan did everything first. At least they met China after the US, but actually earlier prime ministers were planning to meet before the US. Just as Nixon and Kissinger were making their move, Japan kept getting on their nerves. Because the US couldn't act that way, it had a certain naivete. It's called romanticism, idealism, but Japan has no such thing. That's why Japan is scary. They're hardcore realists. They even tried to do something with North Vietnam first. So they asked the US if they could go. And Kissinger replied, "Sure, go. Just don't expect to know when we'll be bombing." That was his way of warning they might bomb Hanoi while the Japanese delegation was still there. Naturally, that's deeply offensive. You don't mess with a hegemonic power like that. Sure, they call themselves the leader of the free world, but Japan, you lost the war to us. So act like a defeated nation, not so stubborn and defiant. So Lockheed Martin, the US aerospace company, had been bribing multiple countries to sell its aircraft. That became known as the Lockheed scandal. At the time, Tanaka's political rival was the sitting prime minister. Tanaka had already stepped down due to a previous scandal, so his rival sought US cooperation to bury him for good. The US usually doesn't do that, but honored Japan's request. In the process of Japanese prosecutors confronting Lockheed executives, they sat in on US prosecutorial interviews. With no cross-examination, they used that testimony to indict and eliminate Tanaka. Nakasone politically admired Tanaka and was probably from his faction. But when it came to Tanaka's downfall, he never mentioned the US involvement. Instead, he reflected on it as a shameful moment for Japan's prosecutors. Because Nakasone observed Tanaka closely, he knew how frightening the US could be. So as soon as he became prime minister, he went to the US, and at some dinner with the Washington Post, he said Japan would become for America, in parentheses, mine or the scholars, for America, unsinkable aircraft carrier. The issue at the time was the Sea of Okhotsk, Japan's northern sea, which connects to Alaska. Reagan was implementing the Star Wars program to intercept all Soviet nuclear missiles. But there was one thing that could slip through. If the Soviets stationed nuclear submarines in the Sea of Okhotsk and launched from underwater, the US couldn't detect them in the critical response time. To deal with that, US needed Japan's help. What we learn from this is that Japan is basically America's frontier, its neighbor. We're not considered neighbors of the US thanks to Japan. Japan shares a maritime border with the US. Nakasone's statement made his popularity soar. He enjoyed considerable autonomy and served as prime minister for a long time. Then Reagan shoved the Plaza Accord down their throat. From then on, Japan entered a near-dead state and has never fully recovered. To Japan, the US is terrifying. Japanese people know it's different from Korea. Do you know this movie? It was remade in Korea too. It's called Golden Slumber. I really enjoyed it. The movie opens with a Japanese prime minister who's anti-American. He gets assassinated live on TV by a drone. But it turns out the assassination was done by Japan's own intelligence, and they frame an innocent guy. The story follows the protagonist fleeing with help from ordinary citizens. That's Golden Slumber. I think the title comes from a Beatles song. We have anti-American sentiment in Korea too. But Korean anti-Americanism is something the US tolerates. They let it slide because it's not substantial. The kind of anti-Americanism the US cannot tolerate is Japan's. It's sensitive. Japan genuinely fears the US because they fought before. The US doesn't let Japanese politics swing around loosely like it does in Korea. They intervene directly and leave traces of that intervention. You see this in films. In 1984, the yen was effectively doubled in value. The Japanese companies that seemed poised to take over the world collapsed after that. With the yen's appreciation, Korea's economy soared. It was our big chance. Even Samsung Electronics rose because of this. In semiconductors, no single company is normally allowed to dominate such a strategic global industry. But somehow it happened. The market crashed to 1/5 of its peak and still hasn't recovered. This isn't Bitcoin I'm talking about, it's the Nikkei index. So after the Plaza Accord, with the yen's appreciation, Japanese people, once icons of diligence and hard work, they used to work tirelessly and sincerely. Suddenly, they all rushed into stock and real estate speculation. Land prices and stocks were rising by the day. They went mad. It must have felt great while it was soaring. Did the US intend all this? If so, it'd be a conspiracy theory. Probably not intended, but that's how it turned out. Back in 1990, when I was in college, all the business professors taught Japanese economics. But were they educated in Japan? No, they studied in the US. They studied in America during the 1980s, but came back having learned only about Japan. In the 1980s, American business academia was fully immersed in Japanese-style production methods and labor management structures. Even Japan's seniority system swept through US academia. The fear Americans now have toward China is a recent development. But with Japan, it was on a whole different level. And Japan had lost the war to them. And the Japanese were pretty reckless too. Sony bought Columbia Pictures. They were buying symbolic assets. Mitsubishi even bought the Rockefeller Center. It was madness. In Tokyo, there's the Imperial Palace site. At the time, they said you could sell that land and buy all of California. The fear that Japan would devour the US was overwhelming. These books here were all novels about that fear of Japan. I only read one of them, Rising Sun by Michael Crichton. It was made into a movie. China's in trouble now because they've become America's target, and that's the last thing they needed. Want to know what happens when you become America's target? Just look at Japan. Hayao Miyazaki spirited away, right? They literally disappeared because they became a US target. This film criticizes the bubble economy. Of course, there's a search for hope in it. Watch it again and you'll see the allegories. They're not subtle at all. They passed through an amusement park from the bubble era. Her parents represent ordinary Japanese citizens. They saw food and devoured it greedily. And what happened? They turned into pigs. The older generation became pigs by gorging themselves, and who saves them? It's the pure hearts of young children. That purity reflects Japan's traditional spirit of war, harmony. It's the return to the old Japan. Japan still has that within them. That's why Japan by nature can never be America's true spiritual ally. They still have their claws. Japan's anti-Americanism is real because they used to be an independent center of power. Even to China, they never bowed. They've always had an independent identity. Watch that movie again. It sends that very message. When I look at Hayao Miyazaki's work, the first theme is anti-American and the second is anti-capitalist. He's a very strong advocate of those themes. His father was from Manchukuo and ran an aircraft factory there, which eventually failed. That's why flying always appears in his films. Dragons fly, Totoro flies, the cat bus flies, something is always flying. In Korea, you wouldn't see movies this overtly anti-capitalist or anti-American. Spirited Away is exactly that. The US-Japan alliance is built on two inseparable pillars. One is Japan's acceptance of America's leadership in international affairs. The other is America allowing Japan access to the global and US markets. That was Paul Volcker's statement. This book talks about how the US kept shaking Japan down. Whatever happens, they pressure Japan, raise the yen, and Japan complies. And yet, it's hard to say this was entirely one-sided. It wasn't entirely one-sided. The Japanese are rational people, they calculate. What I mean is this. They prospered within the system the US built. So if America collapses, it's bad for them too. Sure, if it were the militarists from the imperial era, they'd probably cheer, but that's very rare. They don't want America to fall, so they help. They help even more than West Germany. The problem is China isn't Japan. After hide your strength, bide your time, and peaceful rise, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative aggressively, seeking to elevate its global status while upgrading its domestic industries with accumulated capital. Since 2010, when China's gains began to exceed its contributions, it became a threat to the system's stability. As I mentioned earlier, China was a country of production and saving, while the US was a country of consumption and debt. But from 2012 to 2014, China stopped buying more US Treasury bonds. Today, Japan is once again the largest holder of US Treasuries. You need money even to be the world's policeman. To play that role, the US needs low interest rates. And for that, someone must buy its bonds. Sure, Americans could buy them, but American citizens are like the pigs in spirited away they consume. They spend, they don't save. So Japan buys those bonds, or China used to. That's how they contribute to global order. Without it, the US could withdraw. But China isn't like Japan. China is cutting itself off from the US and the international community controlling capital too. That's why the US is sanctioning Huawei and blocking China's rise in semiconductors. They've drawn a line. You're not allowed to rise into high tech. When the global order was in crisis, Japan adopted a constitution dependent on the US and chose a soft landing. What that means is Japan accepted the Plaza Accord knowing it would inevitably lead to this outcome. But the mainstream view is that Japan didn't realize it. They had gone through yen appreciation before. They didn't expect the people to turn into pigs, so to speak. They thought they'd endure the yen appreciation again. But they didn't expect everyone to rush into real estate and stocks. They expected a soft landing, but things went off course. Still, Japan didn't experience a systemic collapse or revolution because of it. Because Japan had a system that could withstand the shock. But China can't accept America's demands because by confronting the US, the Chinese regime actually strengthens domestic unity and its own legitimacy. If they chose a soft landing like Japan, it would threaten the Chinese Communist Party's one-party rule. So China doesn't have many options. And then came the COVID crisis in 2020. Since it originated in China and many Americans died, so punishing China became a major issue in US politics, with no difference between the parties. Geopolitical competition has become a basic condition for survival. People around the world saw what happened to Ukraine and realized geopolitics is real. Even masks and basic medical supplies became strategic goods. Those are strategic goods now, and they even get intercepted in transit. There are now so many items considered essential. We must produce these domestically. In the end, it all leads to protectionism and self-sufficiency. The old supply chains that spanned across borders horizontally, you can't place factories in China anymore, different systems, different values. Meanwhile, the metaverse is expanding without limits, isn't it? The metaverse transcends borders. There are no boundaries there. You have to factor all of this into your perspective and design your life accordingly. In short, it's not simple. It's incredibly complex. The conflict between the US and China. We used to believe that if every country engaged in trade, everyone would survive. But COVID taught us that strategic goods exist and that it's risky to place factories in countries like China. At the same time, the metaverse has no borders. Supply chains are once again constrained by national borders. But the metaverse, it's completely borderless. That's the contrast. Since the Obama administration, the US has been sending signals to the world. Syria used chemical weapons, but the US didn't respond. Obama gave a great speech, then let it slide. When Russia forcibly annexed Crimea in 2014, the US only imposed economic sanctions. It connects to Ukraine. Before that, Russia attacked Georgia in 2008. That was near the end of the Bush presidency. Again, no action. With Myanmar's military coup, they only made statements. North Korea's nuclear tests, the collapse of democracy in Hong Kong, they let it all go. This shift in the world order, this rapid change, according to Peter Zeihan, one of the main reasons is this. President Carter's idealistic doctrine stated that the Middle East was of vital national interest. Stable oil supply was considered essential for U.S. survival. So they wouldn't tolerate any hegemonic challenge in the Middle East. But now that the U.S. has become the world's largest oil producer, they have neither the will nor interest to remain involved in the Middle East mess. That's America's position. So who suffers if the Middle East gets chaotic? China suffers. But while China's hurting, countries like Korea and Japan suffer even more. China's trilemma, these three national dilemmas, are hard to resolve. First, China must maintain the Communist Party's rule. To do that, they must unify a vast multi-ethnic country. And they must maintain friendly relations with Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. But these three goals conflict with one another. So if you had to choose one, what would you pick? Getting along with Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, or keeping Tibet and Xinjiang under Chinese control, or maintaining the Communist Party's rule? Which of the three is the top priority? Regime survival number one. Second, either maintaining good relations and trade with neighbors, or claiming Tibet, Xinjiang, and Uyghur regions as undeniably Chinese. That's the order, the real priority list. If one conflicts with another, China is willing to abandon the lesser. Unfortunately, we're China's neighbor. What a headache. To conclude, America is tired. They used to accept economic losses in order to maintain geopolitical advantage, like with Saudi Arabia, where strategy took a back seat to economic benefits. But eventually, that didn't work either. There was once a fantasy: China will change. China produces and saves while the US consumes. So even though the American working class has few decent jobs, they still consume while doing temp jobs because consumption is good and inflation was low. Whether Trump figured it out or not, their frustration built up. Why don't we have decent jobs? All the good jobs are in Korea, Japan, Germany, and China. They gave up on American manufacturing, these corrupt elites. That's how they saw it. And Trump put that into words. Once it was verbalized, even the American mainstream couldn't stop what followed. It's wild now. Kicking a sitting president off Twitter was absurd. Then restoring him, and now Apple's acting up again. It's chaos. That's why George Friedman says the US is in a state of civil war. He predicts the US will face internal conflict for the next 5 years. On a broader level, it's about whether the US can remain the center of a global empire. The US also faces its own dilemmas, double, triple challenges. Its internal republicanism, this political dynamism. Will it continue to allow that and give up being an empire? Or will it suppress domestic volatility? Will the media and elites unite to crush people like Trump whenever they appear, giving the people voting rights in name only and running a predictable, manual-driven politics? And they'll keep debating irrelevant things like gay marriage, which have nothing to do with geopolitics. Just fighting over abortion and other social issues. Maybe that's the direction. Even if the US maintains its current hegemony, it'll be hard to stop Bitcoin. I've already explained that when I talked about the euro-dollar. The mainstream theory is that the US will retreat or withdraw. Would the US still try to shut down Bitcoin even as it retreats? Absolutely not. If the US withdraws, the world will face chaos. But not equally. The weakest will collapse first. Anyway, when that crisis comes, people will need dollars, gold, or Bitcoin. Because the metaverse is connected without borders. Will China maintain its current unified system for the next 10 years? It probably will. But whether the Communist Party will follow Xi Jinping's path of permanent rule, that's doubtful. Today's key question is Japan. Here's what I still haven't figured out what I'm interested in. Will the US feel secure enough to let Japan take charge of Northeast Asia and withdraw? If the US pulls out of the Korean Peninsula or Japan, it means handing responsibility to Japan. Handing over what? The containment of China. So we'd have to get along well with Japan. That's Peter Zeihan's advice. But here's my doubt. Does the US really trust Japan? From what I've studied, Americans don't truly trust the Japanese. Why? Because they know what they did. They dropped atomic bombs. And for 70 years, the US has essentially kept Japan under pressure. They probably did that because they feared Japan. So does the US really trust Japan? I disagree with Peter Zeihan on that point. If Japan were more like Korea, maybe they would. because Korea isn't directly adjacent to the US. But Japan is, it shares a maritime border with the US. If you look at a map, there's nothing between the US and Japan, especially to the north. Of course, Japan is an ally of the US. Its military goes wherever the US goes. And the more it does, the more Japan waves yellow handkerchiefs at America. The problem is Korea. If there were real anti-American sentiment there, but I don't think there truly is. Real anti-Americanism is actually pro-Japan, not in the current sense, but aligning with Japan's traditional spirit, as I mentioned earlier. To the US, that's a nightmare, because Japan once defied the US and they're capable. I'm not sure China has that same capability. When a communist country like China opposes the US, it doesn't mean much to the US anymore. They've learned to deal with it, because communism tends to destroy its own economy. They self-destruct first. Just look at North Korea. They're aggressive, but not really a threat. But Japan wasn't opened by the US. They achieved significant modernization on their own during the Edo period. When the black ships arrived, they transformed and became a global power in just 30 to 40 years. Their learning ability is no joke. So if a Japan like that were to get along closely with Korea, imagine if they did that and took an independent path. That's unthinkable. From the US point of view, it's right there next to them. Would they tolerate it? Look at America. They say they're pulling back globally, but they're still doing everything. South America is still unable to defy the US. The US's Atlantic neighbor, Britain, looks like America and speaks the same language. And no matter what, Britain never really defies the US. The real issue is Japan across the Pacific. Australia is not a problem. It's similar to Britain. Korea's anti-Americanism is more symbolic, mostly from communists, so it's not really threatening. And in Japan, it's actually the left-wing groups that the US has manipulated. The US uses Japan's leftists quite a bit. Even if their ideologies differ, they know that. A geopolitically dominant power doesn't care much about ideology. When the US embraced China, Mao didn't say, "We'll abandon communism." Mao entered a quasi-military alliance with the US, but it took 10 years to open the market. In geopolitics, that stuff doesn't really matter well, not entirely, but mostly. Japan has deep capabilities. So here's my question, something for you to ponder. Will the US pull out of the Korean Peninsula? If so, it means they trust Japan. But I don't think the US trusts Japan that much. So I infer that they won't withdraw from the Korean Peninsula. That's the dilemma, I think. On the surface, the US is saying to Japan, you be the boss in this region. That's the advice and prediction of Peter Zeihan and other geopolitical experts. So you've ended up learning geopolitics through the excuse of Bitcoin. Thanks for staying with me until now. See you again next time.